Hello, and welcome to this short presentation on dealing with difficult students in the college classroom. My name is Brad Mitchell, and I'm an Associate Professor of Psychology here at Ivy Tech Community College in Valparaiso. As you know, this is a very busy time of year for college faculty as we're busy putting together our syllabi and putting together our courses in preparation for the new semester. Not this one. As you know, this is a very busy time for faculty as we're putting together our syllabi and putting our courses together for the next semester. What we're going to talk about tonight is essentially looking at the difficult behavioral students that you may have in your classroom. Now, we know that there's a lot of different reasons for behavioral issues, and sometimes it's not something that is of anybody's particular fault. But when there are behavioral issues that we can deal with as faculty, it behooves us to understand where the behavior is coming from, what we can do, and what we can't do. So what I'm going to do today is basically go over some general ideas of what kind of problems you may see in your students, as well as some things that you can do. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about a very specific population of students that have unique behavioral issues when it comes to the classroom. And that is the group of people who have been diagnosed and are within the spectrum of autism. We are seeing many more students in the spectrum of autism that are coming to college campuses, and they present both a unique opportunity as well as some unique challenges that we as faculty need to be able to address. So I will spend a little bit of time giving you some background information and hopefully give you some good tips on how to deal with all different types of students. So let's get started. As faculty, we all want to think of ourselves like this.
Captain, my captain.
Sit down, Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, boys. Thank you.
But in reality, we get this.
Stand in the corner.
Vinny, you're going to give yourself a third-degree corduroy burn.
Guys, what are you doing? It's over, Eric. We have to come to school on Monday. Just
Mr. Spicoli.
That's the name they gave me. Hey, you're ripping my car.
Yeah.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
No problem at all. I think you know where the front office is.
So let's begin today looking at the difficult student. We're going to look at the struggles and opportunities of engaging students in and out of the classroom. Specifically, we're going to be covering the stages of target behaviors, the stages of verbal escalation. We're going to look at the 7 different types of difficult students, and then we're going to look at a special case. We're going to look at target behaviors with individuals within the autistic spectrum. So what we want to do to begin with is we want to understand where students are coming from. And to do that, we need to look at the stages of behavior. What's going on when a student is acting out inside of class or within the confines of the academic structure. So when we're looking at students, most behaviors are going to begin and ramp up. So they're going to begin with a stage we call anxiety. And anxiety, we're not talking about the clinical term here. We're talking about a noticeable change in behavior because they're projecting that something may be going wrong, so they're changing their current behaviors to address what they fear may be coming later. And as faculty, if we start to notice anxiety, the best way that we can help those students is to be supportive. This is a non-judgmental and empathic way of helping a student to understand that anxiety is completely normal and that you expect it, and you should expect it, because anxiety is something that is programmed inside of humans to be beneficial. Historically, when we were more of a hunter-gatherer society, anxiety told us that something was wrong. It was the activation of the autonomic nervous system, and it told us that we may need to fight or flight or freeze. And so when a student is having anxiety, they're going to feel like something is very wrong, and we need to be empathic and let them know that we understand where they're coming from and try to set up a situation or an atmosphere that's conducive to them calming themselves down. If the anxiety is not alleviated, not by anything that the faculty does, but basically it just keeps going, sometimes the student will become defensive. And this is where they start to lose that rationality. They start to challenge. And the best thing we can do as faculty members or as staff or as peers, wherever we're looking at this, is we need to be directive. We need to set the limits, and we need to make sure that the student or the person that we're dealing with understands that we know that a minute ago they were anxious, but now they're starting to get into a behavior that's just not appropriate for the situation that they're in. So we need to set the limit, telling them to maybe, lower their voice or talk to you outside of class or bring this up at a different time. Set the limit that is going to set up a good situation for you as the instructor, as the faculty member. So I'm going to show a brief video here, and this is from one of my absolute favorite all-time shows, a show that came on NBC for about 5 seasons, and then it trickled over into Yahoo because it wasn't as successful on NBC. It's a show called Community, which you gotta love the fact that it's a series based upon a community college out in Colorado. Abed basically is one of the best characters, in my opinion, from the sitcom era. He is, without a doubt, somewhere on the autistic spectrum. I think, not to get too deep into the character analysis, but he probably has what we used to call Asperger's, very concrete in his thinking. So not only will this give us a good example of what some high-functioning autistic individual might look like in a classroom setting, but this is the type of situation that can happen with any student whatsoever. So our example shows us that if we challenge that individual, that may lead to a bigger problem in the future. If we let it go, sometimes it will go good, sometimes it'll go bad. But one thing that we need to know is that if the verbal escalation continuum keeps going, we are going to see some pretty significant behaviors. And the verbal escalation continuum, for the purposes of for people within our field, people in the post-secondary education realm, people on college and university campuses, we need to deal with verbal escalation very quickly, but we also need to know where we need to let someone else step in and take over for us. In this verbal escalation continuum, we should be responsible as faculty, as support staff, for verbal escalation that contains questioning, refusal, and a little bit of release, and we'll go into each of these in a little bit. But when we get into intimidation, that's a point where faculty and support staff need to be bringing in people who are well-equipped and well-trained to deal with that. And that, in most situations, is security. Somebody from the campus security that will come in and actually deal with a individual who is becoming overtly aggressive and intimidating. But the first step is questioning. When somebody is, kind of getting into, they're past anxiety and they're becoming a little bit more dominant, they might start to ask you questions. And sometimes these questions are good. Information seeking is not necessarily a bad thing. What page are we on? You may see that as an indication that somebody's not paying attention in class, but to be perfectly honest, it's not going to hurt anything to just answer the question. It's going to give them the information, and it may back them off. It may put them back even past the anxiety phase. Maybe they were anxious and they were getting lost, and they ask a question because they're getting frustrated, and you simply answer it, and then you can move on. The flip side of that is the challenging question. Something like, why should I have to do this? And unfortunately, I know for all my math and English compatriots out there, you guys get this more than anybody. I get it a little bit in psych classes because sometimes I'll have an HVAC student or an engineering student come in. It's like, wow, why do I have to learn about this people, brain, mind stuff? And that's more of a challenging question than information seeking, because never once have I heard a student ask the question, well, why do I have to take math? I'm going to be a nurse, or I'm going to be a teacher, or I'm going to be a business person. And a math professor come up and give a beautiful explanation, and the student goes, oh, okay, well, that's why I need to take math. Thank you, professor, for letting me know that. It's never happened. It's always a challenging question. What we do here is we ignore the challenge and we redirect. Okay? This may seem like you're being a little bit disingenuous, almost a bit sarcastic, and so you need to be very careful in how you do this with your tone, your volume, and your cadence, which we'll talk about in a bit, being your paraverbals. But you basically need to say, you know what, everybody has to do it, so let's do the math so we can move on. This happens very frequently during advising, and this is a perfect answer. Why do I have to take math? Why do I have to take speech? Why do I have to take IVYT? Everyone has to do it. Now, let's go registered for it so you can move on into classes that you really want to take. Once we're past questioning, we might get into further escalation, and the one that we really want to look at here is release. Release is that tipping point between something that I think faculty and support staff should be dealing with an aggressive student, and where with the intimidation they should be handing it off. Release is acting out, loss of rationalization, sometimes venting, screaming, swearing. If you can allow this vent, sometimes it will just fix itself. Think about midterms. Think about finals. Somebody is upset because they didn't do well on a test, or they didn't get into the program that they wanted, and really they just need to let it out. I'm not advocating we let everybody just go off constantly, but if you can allow that venting to kind of occur, it might actually allow that student to build a bond with you as the faculty. Now, what I do strongly encourage is try to remove the audience or remove the acting out individual. And what I mean by this is, if you see somebody who's venting in your class, if you can, say, can we talk outside the room for just a second? In a bad situation where somebody's just completely lost rationalization, you may want to ask the rest of the class to simply leave, because sometimes it's easier with the rational group to ask them to leave, and they will. But think about it. Why do we want to remove the audience? Because if there's 20 or 30 people in your class, my assumption is that a couple of them probably aren't real happy with their midterm, or they're not happy with math, or they're not happy with English or communication or business or whatever class that they just took. And if one person starts to vent, it could snowball. And holy cow, one venting student is bad. 30 venting students is bad, even worse. So enforce the limits and try to allow that to happen. And again, if we get to that point of intimidation where somebody's actually in your face or somebody else's face, contact security, contact whoever you need, and make sure that you keep yourself safe and you keep the other students in that situation safe. Tension reduction is something that you will need to deal with after the fact, and if you truly get into this type of situation, I would strongly encourage, I'm quite certain that student affairs and student success and everybody will, without naming this tension reduction, will become involved in this situation. And basically what this is, if you have a student who goes off and releases or refuses or even intimidates, there's a chance we may want to get them reintegrated back into the classroom that they were in at that time. And if you think about it, when you're done being upset, a lot of times you feel it in your body. Tension is reduced. You take that deep breath. And a student who just had a really bad day may be able to reintegrate back into classroom, but that needs to be done in a very specific and prescribed way. Not just that the student shows back up, but maybe we bring in somebody to mediate that with the instructor. So that's something that will come later. It's not something that you need to be worried about because that's something that will happen after the fact. So that acting out student, you need to contact security and remove other students. So keep everybody safe, keep yourself safe. I used to train lifeguards, and that was the first thing that I would tell them is, it's kind of counterintuitive, but if you're a lifeguard and somebody is drowning, the first thing you have to be mindful of is, you're diving in to try to help that person or save that person, but you have to worry about yourself more than the other person, because if you go out there and they grab onto you and they start to drag you down, well, now we have two people that are drowning. So it seems counterintuitive, but lifeguards are trained that if there's a person who's latching onto them and it's creating a problem for them, that maybe the drowning victim is grabbing them around the neck, they may need to physically shove them, and that seems counterintuitive. I'm a lifeguard, I want to go out and save that person, and I'm shoving them off. Well, you can't do much good if you're being drugged underwater. So you need to keep yourself safe so that you can help keep other students safe. So now we're going to talk about the 7 difficult students that you may encounter. And I have found that this is not an all-inclusive list, but it seems like when I present this to faculty members, it's a good way for people to be able to categorize what some historical students have been and what some future students might be. Being able to identify and categorize that student doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to magically fix or prevent anything, but it's going to allow you to say, I've seen this or I've heard about this before, and this is what that situation entailed, and this is the recommendation of how to deal with that student. So we'll start out by just naming the 7 types of behaviors: the explosive student, the antisocial, the passive-aggressive, narcissistic, paranoid, litigious, and compulsive. And what you will see here is, coming from a psychology and psychiatric background, 4 or 5 of these, if you remember from abnormal psych, if you've taken abnormal psych back in undergrad, these should sound, this category should ring a bell. And that's because antisocial, passive-aggressive, kind of, narcissistic, paranoid, compulsive, kind of, are all personality disorders. Not saying that these people who behave in this way, we're not diagnosing anybody with personality disorders, but rather, these are based upon problematic things that people may have as their personality. And so this is based off of some research that's been done on personality disorders, but also on straight behaviors. And so our first student is the explosive student. The explosive student will engage in arguments and threats to maintain their ego or gain attention. So we're not using the Freudian term of ego. We're using the term ego as my current status of who I am, which is kind of Freudian ego, but I digress. This is often incredibly jarring to faculty. And here's why. If you're a faculty member here at Ivy Tech, you have successfully completed not only an undergrad degree, but a graduate degree. And if you're staff, you've probably been successful in school at some level. And so people who have been successful in college at the university level, you were successful for a reason. It's probably because you did relatively well in class. And you just kind of accept that this is the culture, this is the norm, this is how you're supposed to act in a class. And for somebody to just go off and explode, that's not normal in everyday life. If somebody is explosive and threatens people at Walmart or Target or the gas station, that's going to be kind of odd. But we see a lot of people in academia. This is a very sacred place, and it doesn't seem like a place where people will blow up a lot. So how do you deal with that? Again, we go back to the intimidation on the verbal escalation scale. You remove the student, and if they're too aggressive, it may be easier to ask the entire class to leave. Sometimes that will de-escalate the student because they no longer have an audience. Number 2, and this should be number 1, but enlist security. We have security on campus for a reason. Get them down there as quickly as possible. And 3, and this one is somewhat difficult because sometimes I think that we see our class as a small community. And we have to be very careful not to allow for mob justice. We don't want other students to try to intervene because that creates a power imbalance. For one thing, it takes away our authority when a student tries to step in. It also creates a kind of a tiered system of I'm a better student because I'm the one trying to calm you down, and that's going to create, especially for the explosive student, an imbalance that's probably going to frustrate them more than anything, so it's not going to be very helpful. The second one is the antisocial student. And again, if you took Psych 205, this is the one that should scare the bejesus out of you, because antisocial doesn't mean I don't want to go to a party. Antisocial means I really don't have the ethics, morality, conscience that other people have. Antisocial personality disorder is commonly the common phrase that is used to describe those people are psychopath, sociopath. They don't play by your rules because they don't care about your rules. They're oftentimes superior to you, and don't confuse that with narcissism. They just don't care about anybody else. They're a lot of times lacking that social conscious or that morality. They don't have empathy. Now, I'm not saying that the antisocial student is necessarily a psychopath, but we know that about 1% of the population in the United States fits the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, just on different levels. They're not all serial killers. They're not all serial harmers. But we look at somebody like Bernie Madoff. Hopefully that's a name that still kind of conjures up the idea of a person who uses other people by stealing billions of dollars from very wealthy people who thought that he was doing their retirement funding, and come to find out he was just using it for his own personal use, and really didn't seem to care. That's really kind of the psychopath, sociopath, antisocial personality that's not harming people physically, but they definitely are harming people. So what do? We need to be very careful with the antisocial student, because we do know that they are the most common student that will engage in intentional plagiarism. I know, from like my Psych 101 classes, intentional plagiarism is not nearly as problematic in my Psych 101 classes as unintentional plagiarism. And I can't remember the last time that I didn't have a Psych 101 paper where there wasn't at least one instance of unintentional plagiarism where like they forget to cite something, or they're not citing enough, or they've self-plagiarized, which is baffling to most of my freshman students. But the antisocial student is the one who will most commonly engage in intentional plagiarism because they just don't care. They don't feel bad about doing it, and they don't feel like they're going to get caught. One of the ways that we can deal with this individual, and this is good for almost everybody, is considering something like an honor code. It doesn't have to be called an honor code, but basically in your syllabus you have your rules, you have your the expectations and the exceptions for the rules in the syllabus. But your honor code could simply be nothing more than having everybody sign the top of their test saying, I will not, I'm adhering to the honor code and I will not cheat on this exam. The reason this works is not because the antisocial student is going to say, wow, that's what ethics are, that's what morality is. I was going to say the word cured, but that's not the right term. But I finally get it. This is why I shouldn't be doing the things that I'm doing. More so, it's concrete, and they can abide by it if they know exactly what the expectation is. And they may actually respect that honor code a little bit because they have their own code of how they deal with people. The other thing is make penalties proportionate and apply them to all students in equal measure. If the antisocial student finds that you are applying things differently to them or to somebody else, they're gonna pick up on that incredibly quickly. Okay? Passive-aggressive student, number 3. Passive-aggressive student will tell you one thing and all the while never intend to hold up their end of the bargains. This, for new faculty, be mindful that around midterms, and I always warn my students of this, to if they love their grandparents, contact their grandparents around midterms and finals, because for some reason, and I've yet to figure out why, heavy sarcasm here, there are so many grandparents who die during midterm and finals week. And I've had grandparents who have been killed off around that time 6 or 7 times. I mean, these people must be cats because they're coming back to life. These are the students who may sleep, they'll show up late for class, they'll have an excuse why they haven't turned in their paper, and they'll ask for they'll give some great story, and they'll ask for some extension, or they'll ask for some special privilege. but they really don't have any notion that they're going to hold up their end of the bargain. How to deal? Lead by example. I'm like everybody else. There's going to be times where you're going to be late because you get caught in the hallway or you get caught in our lovely Indiana weather with our lovely Indiana roads. But the first time you're late, they'll latch onto it and they will see that, hey, this is apparently acceptable, because if the professor is late, if the instructor is late, then I can be late. Inform the students that sleeping in class will result in being asked to leave. That's, in my opinion, that's not a huge stretch. If they're sleeping, you can give them one chance, wake them up. If they fall back asleep, you can ask them to leave because they are being disruptive. It's a passive way of being disruptive, but definitely, you know as well as I do that if somebody's sleeping in class, it's a distraction to you. It's distracting to you, and it's distracting to other people as well. So that's something that I feel is incredibly appropriate, asking them to leave if they can't stay awake. And for them, if it's truly something where they're tired because of work or something else, they're not doing themselves any good by sitting in class and being asleep. Number 4 is that narcissistic student. They come up with some awesome phrases that we love to hear, like, I pay your salary. Or I read on the internet, because we all know Wikipedia is 100% accurate. And I know, and usually this is coming at a contradiction to what you've just said, I know because evidence, whatever that evidence might be. The narcissistic student feels self-entitled, and they don't respect boundaries. You need to be very careful not to give them ammunition by giving them information about yourself. Now, as a psychology professor, a lot of times I will use anecdotes from my clinical experiences, and sometimes it's hard not to talk about personal experiences that are more personal than professional, because those are the good anecdotes that you have. The narcissistic student will take information about you and try to twist it around and sometimes even use it against you. So only give out personal information as it pertains to the curriculum. And again, that's, for me, I'm as guilty as anybody about that, and I want you to be mindful that obviously we want to be personable with our students and we want to engage with them, and so we don't have to protect our personal outside of academia life with a knife, but just be careful on who you're giving it out to, because sometimes that may come back to get you. The paranoid student, some of these are even better than the narcissistic student. You didn't cover this in the lecture, which is one of my favorite things, because if I don't say it explicitly during the lecture, it must not exist. Just because you'd have to pull the cellophane off your textbook to read it. I'm being a little bit sarcastic here. We never talked about this. This professor is the worst. The paranoid student is looking for the reason that they are not responsible for the fact that they did poorly or failed or didn't do what they needed to do. The paranoid student, you just need to be direct. Faculty, sometimes you feel, and I feel, like we can't defend ourselves. Like if a student says, we didn't cover this in class, like, oh man, you know what, maybe I didn't. It was in the textbook, but I didn't go over it explicitly. And then you get that kind of wishy-washy feeling in your gut. But you can defend yourself, and you should. And one thing that we don't want to do a lot, but if you are truly at an impasse with a student where the student and you just are not jiving, we do offer other sections of almost every course. Some not, but there's, for Psych 101, I look back, and if I have a student who absolutely is not jiving with me, I may offer them, like, hey, you may want to find a different section. I'll go down to the registrar with you, and we can see if, maybe we can get you into an adjuncts course, because I'm not hitting it off with you, and that's no offense on you, that's no offense on them. Sometimes we're just not going to work well together, and to just continue on with our head down is kind of silly. This isn't passing the buck. This is setting the student up for success. This is kind of a behavior of last resort from the faculty. I would not encourage this all the time, or else the registrar is going to learn to really dislike seeing you come down there, and student services as well. But this is something that is available if need be for best practice. The litigious student. I absolutely love the last 2 weeks of class, because every student becomes pre-law. And the kind of sequence that you will tend to hear from the litigious student is, I'm going to email your supervisor about whatever this problem is. I emailed your supervisor. You will be hearing from your supervisor. Then inevitably, the computer makes that dinging sound. If we were back in the 1990s, it would be that very awkward, "You've got mail." But you hear the ding, and you have the email from your supervisor. And they will go up the ladder, down the ladder, sideways on the ladder. They'll call the president. They'll call Putin. They'll call the president of Zaire, whoever they need to call, until somebody trickles down that you need to do what they wanted you to do. Not going to get into the kind of the culture, and we always try to blame the youngins, and that's how I know I'm getting old, because I need a rocking chair on my porch and yell at the kids. But this does seem to be kind of a younger culture thing that they just keep taking complaints up and up and up until they find somebody that's going to do something about it. What can you do? If anybody in here is in a clinical field, medical field, almost anything, I know that from the very first clinical job I ever had, document, document, document. I always teach my people who are going into psychology or going into social behavioral applied sciences, like social workers, counselors, psychologists. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. Okay. The other thing is, live by the syllabus, die by the syllabus. We all should have that amazing paragraph at the end of our syllabus called the right of revision. That this syllabus is a contract, but we have the right to revise things based upon need, and we will communicate that to the students. I always use the example of I'm not going to go in and change things willy-nilly, but we live in Indiana, and if I have something set for week 14, which is in December, we may have snow. Heck, we may have snow in March or April, or we may have snow in October. Who knows? So I need to be able to revise that syllabus so that we can be successful. Or, using Psych 101, maybe I'm in Chapter 5 about conditioning and the students just aren't getting it, so I may need to go a second week on that, which means I'm going to have to change the schedule for the rest of the semester. So that's what that right of revision is. So, but if we can, we want to live by the syllabus, die by the syllabus, and that helps us with the litigious student. And finally, we have the compulsive student. And the compulsive student is what we think the instructor's dream, but this is the student who is meticulous to a fault. This is the student who will stand up at the end of class and say, but didn't you say we were supposed to have a quiz today? Or didn't you say at the beginning of class you were going to give us an assignment? And everybody in the class wants to wring this person's neck or pat them on the back. I shouldn't say wring their neck. That's a little aggressive. This is the student who's going to be compulsive about that, and they're going to follow the letter of the law, kind of like the litigious one, but they're doing it because it's more their personality. How to deal with this? Guys, remain perfectly imperfect. You're imperfect. They're imperfect. We're all imperfect. But we all get along and we all do our thing and we get through the semester. So we remind students that faculty are hired because of their qualifications. We've all been through the hiring process. We've all been credentialed. And trust me, Ivy Tech, if you are here, you have been through a stronger credentialing process than any other local college. We are strict about this. And so we really don't need the student's approval. If you are teaching that class, unless you are an awesome person with Photoshop, you had a real transcript turned in and you are qualified to teach your class, you don't need their approval. Now, you don't have to be snarky about it, but you're qualified. You know your stuff. You are the faculty member. You don't need the student's approval, but just remind them that you were hired because of your qualifications. Which brings us to the last section, a special type of student, a special kind of difficult. Now, I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because I've been rambling quite a bit and I don't want to keep you guys long. But in the community college setting, we're seeing more and more students within the autistic spectrum. And I'm not going to go off on a rant because if this isn't Psych 205, but as of 2015, many of you probably have a lot of experience with people with autism. You may have somebody in your family, a close friend. But as of 2015, with the DSM-5, if you know somebody who has Asperger's or PDD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which is basically autism but not traditional autism, you don't know that person who has Asperger's or PDD-NOS. What I mean by that is, in 2015 DSM-5, they pretty much took all of those other lower level autisms and they brought them in, and now they're all within the autistic spectrum. So somebody with Asperger's now has the diagnosis of autism. Okay, so I can use the term globally, people within the autistic spectrum, even though I still, when I'm talking with somebody with Asperger's, still refer to Asperger's, and I still use it, kind of loosely in practice. It's not technically a diagnosis anymore. But what we need to know, especially being here at Ivy Tech, is that a recent study showed that students with autism are attending post-secondary education at a much higher rate than they were 10 years ago, almost 500%. Fivefold. It's increased. And of those students, 82% either start or complete their academic training at a community college. And somebody asked me at the last time I presented this a couple days ago, why is that? What's going on there? First off, there's a lot more better treatments that are getting people with autism through high school and making them more successful academically. But why are they coming to community college? A lot of reasons, and a lot of good reasons, that really speak well to the community college atmosphere. One, smaller classrooms. Two, more one-on-one, but the potential for one-on-one attention. They're not going to get lost in a 400-person auditorium. But three, sometimes they have some difficulties. They have some leveling classes that they need to take. They may not be university ready, but they're definitely ready to come in to the community college setting where we have open enrollment. So that's why we're seeing a lot of these individuals coming into the community colleges. So again, this is basically just looking at, we switched from the DSM-4 TR to the DSM-5, and now we just have autism for everyone. So what we really need to know when we're looking at persons with autism is, what is autism? And I don't have 4 hours to go over this, but basically it's a neurological and developmental disorder in which there are deficits of communication, there are deficits of theory of mind, which I'll talk about in a minute, and there's some neurological wiring issues, for short version. For anybody who's ever taken the Myers-Briggs, a lot of people have taken that 4-letter acronym that you can get. It tells you about your personality. The most common type, there's a high correlation between autism and ISTJ. That's introverted, sensing, thinking, and judging. This is a very rare type of Myers-Briggs. Is the second most rare, and that number really correlates to the potential number. If we take everybody who has personality disorders like schizoid or schizotypal that may be undiagnosed autism plus autism, we kind of get around that 2% mark, and so this may be just kind of the manifestation of what autism looks like in human beings. So when you think about it, this is an introverted, intuitive, thinking, perceiving individual. They're rational. They have a knack for problem solving. This is Einstein would have been the archetype for the INTP. The downside is they can be very critical, which I see as an upside because, again, I've worked a lot with people with autism, especially people with Asperger's, and the one thing they will do for you, like no one else, is they will tell you exactly what they think. If you're ever wondering what your outfit looks like and you know somebody who has Asperger's or high-functioning autism and you ask them, you're going to get a really straightforward response. Hey, how's my hair look today? I just got it cut. Wow, that looks like crap. Well, thank you. There's not a lot of sugarcoating there. They are very critical, very direct. One skill that most people with autism fail to have is something called theory of mind. And this is a very deep, almost philosophical way of looking at how our conscious mind works. But basically, theory of mind is, if I'm sitting, I'm talking with somebody, or if I were up here lecturing to you, and I looked out at you, and you were yawning, or you were kind of looking around and kind of looked bored, my mind would say, I see that you're looking like you're disengaging, so I need to change my tact. I need to become more interesting. You, on the other hand, see me looking at you, and you're like, oh, crap. He caught me nodding off. He caught me looking away. I need to straighten up and act like and I'll start nodding my head and pretending like I'm paying attention so that he thinks that I think that I'm paying attention. And so I see you do that, and I think that you thought that I was being critical of you, so you changed the way you were doing something, so I start to change. And you can see where this goes down a rabbit hole, okay? Good way to look and understand what theory of mind is. Watch ESPN and watch a couple hours of probably incredibly boring for most people, but watch people play poker. and that is theory of mind on steroids, because it's basically, I'm pretending to bluff, but I actually have a good hand, and that person's looking at me. It's like, well, is he pretending to bluff, or is he really having a good hand? So I'm going to pretend like I don't have a good hand, but I'm hoping he'll think, and it goes like 18 levels deep. Okay, that's theory of mind. People with autism do not have theory of mind. They tend not to be able to understand what other people are thinking, and they just tend to not care. So, a couple of real quick tips for the classroom. I swear, I know I've been talking too long and too fast now because I'm starting to jumble my words. But really quick, tip number 1. All individuals with autism implicitly have a diagnosis of ADHD. Now, a lot of people with autism will have on their diagnostic chart, they will have a diagnosis of ADHD, but having autism means you already have ADHD, so there's no real reason to put that as a diagnosis, except, fun fact, if somebody has both diagnoses, it's probably for medications. That a psychostimulant is going to benefit their autism, but psychostimulants are not approved for treating autism, so you'll see a lot of clinicians, a lot of physicians or psychiatrists will basically just put ADHD as a secondary or tertiary, and so they can get that medication approved. Number 2, with people with autism, you want to be as concrete as possible when it comes to assignments, grading rubric, and class expectations. People with autism, and I'm generalizing here, and I do apologize, but people with autism tend to love rubrics because it explicitly tells them what they need to do to be successful. So rules, rubrics, and responsibilities, that's what I call the tri-R of autism. It'll help everybody. It'll even help you. Number 3, watch and pay attention. You're at the front of the room, so you can see when behaviors are starting to happen. You can see when somebody is becoming anxious or anybody, not just the individual that you think may have autism or has been identified as having autism, all students. It's a good idea to be watching and constantly kind of checking in, whether that be implicit, whether that be explicit, kind of checking in and make sure everybody is okay. Number 4, nonverbal communication does not work well, but paraverbals do. So my communication people, my speech people, I'm sorry. This is a group where nonverbal communication, like facial expressions, they tend to be lost on people with autism. Through applied behavior analysis, they can be trained to pick up on different facial cues, but they're never going to feel it like what we do. If you look at the research of Paul Ekman, he did facial action coding and microexpressions, and his research shows that across the spectrum of humanity, whether it's first world, third world, Aborigines, people tend to be able to pick up on nonverbal communication, smiles, frowns, growls. People with autism tend not to be able to do this. However, they do really well with paraverbals, our tone, our volume, and our cadence of speech. That's because they're very good at picking up on changes. So if your tone or volume or cadence changes, they'll tend to be able to pick up on that and see that that's something concrete that they can see as a change. Number 5, be aware of your synesthetes. Okay, I'm not going to go really deep into this, but synesthesia is something that most people with autism have. And what it is for lack of a very long explanation, it's a quirky wiring of the brain where sensory input comes in and it actually is it's perceived in 2 different parts or possibly even 3 parts of the brain. So for example, a very common type of synesthesia for people with autism is visual auditory synesthesia, where they will see a color, and when they see that color, they're also getting neural impulses to the auditory system of the brain, and they're actually hearing that color. About 2% of the population actually have synesthesia that don't have autism, and a lot of times you'll hear about like musicians, really great musicians who say they can feel music. I believe Harry Connick Jr. is somebody who I think has synesthesia, where he basically doesn't need to read music to play the piano. He kind of feels it. And so he's having a kinesthetic reaction to music. And so, we always say, I felt the music, it moved me. But for these people, they literally feel it in parts of their body. Really kind of an awesome way. But be very careful with people with autism, because too much sensory input may really cause some perceptual imbalances. And I find this ironic because if you look here on the screen, that is the international symbol for Autism Speaks, and that would actually drive somebody with synesthesia, like somebody with autism, crazy because it's so busy. It would, if they have visual, auditory synesthesia, they'd be hearing all these colors as they looked at all those colors, and that doesn't sound normal for me to say hearing colors, but that's what's happening. And then finally, be careful with comedy. And this is something I needed to learn the hard way over and over and over. You know, as a clinician and as faculty, we want to try to at least be moderately entertaining, if nothing else, so that we can entertain ourselves when we're doing the 8th or 10th or 20th time that we're lecturing on the same thing in a couple of years. No matter what your style of teaching, there's one thing, and again, I'm guilty. I had to learn this the hard way over and over, and I still do. Students with autism and people, not just students with autism, but a lot of students have trouble with sarcasm, okay? Think of it this way. Imagine you're texting somebody and you send a message that you meant as sarcastic, but the person read it and like, whoa, that just sounds like a real jerk move. We'll go with jerk. Sometimes you can't read sarcasm very well, and people with autism don't understand that sarcasm, because remember, they're really good with paraverbals, and sarcasm is kind of the I'm saying something that sounds serious, but I'm saying it in such a way that it's supposed to be sarcastic. But if you think about sarcasm, people usually do it kind of at a deadpan way, and then when you hear that, wow, what the content of that communication was doesn't match with being, you know, flat in affect, flat in voice, that's where we pick up on what sarcasm is. For somebody with autism, it just sounds like, well, that was a continuation of the tone, volume, and cadence, the paraverbals, and they don't see it as sarcasm. They just see it as accurate. So be careful with your comedy. Okay, I'm not going to run this video here, but if a lot of people have seen this on Facebook. I do have this video. It's available on this flow that you'll be able to see the website at the top at the very end. But if you ever feel like you have a student that you just can't get through to, watch Chris's story. It is one of the most amazing stories of a dad who has no expertise and no experience working with somebody with extreme developmental disabilities, and he just put his head down and figured it out, and he took a young man who was non-communicative, aggressive, just hard for anybody to work with, and he made him into a young man that is amazingly as well-adjusted as he could have ever been in his life. So if you ever have a student that you just feel like you're never going to get through to, watch Chris's story. It's really awesome. So this is where the point where I would say questions, but I'm not here. So what I am going to say is contact me anytime if you have any questions. My email is bmitchell@ivytech.edu. You can find me on campus. I'm usually pretty darn loud in my classroom, and so if you just pop in, I can let you know what's going on. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm more than happy to go over this a little bit more, although I've been talking now much longer than what I expected. I do appreciate everybody's attention, and if you have specific questions or specific problems or specific students you want to talk about, I am always more than willing to lend consultation. Just remember that I don't charge for that, so you get what you pay for, 0 for 0. I don't hold any warranty, but again, I'll try my best. So thank you all, and hopefully we have a great year. Thanks a lot.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.